How can you use the Psalms to solve family and financial problems? Maya used the wisdom, power, and spiritual strength of the Psalms to face terrible personal and family problems, including issues with her partner, problems with her children, financial troubles, and many other serious situations that can happen in any family. Over the course of 7 episodes, you will follow Maya's journey. You will see how she used the power and strength of the Psalms to deal with financial problems and loneliness as a mother and wife. You will witness how she faced manipulation and emotional abuse from her partner, and you will see how he turned her children against her. You will see how she overcame her husband's betrayal with her childhood best friend, someone she considered a sister, and why she gave up her rights to save her children. You'll see how she turned her life around, gained emotional and financial independence, and found new love. If you learned something from what we're going to show you today, please like and subscribe to the channel to help us grow and produce more content like this. Let's begin the first part of Maya's journey. Maya was doing some minor home renovations. Mark, the contractor, a man with dust in his eyebrows and a pencil behind his ear, turned his expectant gaze to Maya. He was holding up 2 paint swatches, a pale gray and a slightly warmer beige, against the wall. It was a simple decision, a choice she had been thinking about for weeks, picturing how the morning light would hit each color. She opened her mouth to speak, the word beige already forming on her tongue, but another voice sliced through the air first, sharp and smooth as a shard of glass. "Honey, why don't you get us some coffee? Let the adults handle this." It was Daniel, her husband. He hadn't looked up from his phone, but the words were aimed at her with surgical precision. Mark the contractor, bless his heart, tried to pretend he hadn't heard, suddenly finding the baseboard intensely fascinating. But Maya heard. She felt the words land, not as sound, but as a physical impact. A hot wave of shame that washed over her face and settled as a cold stone in her stomach. An adult, she was a 39-year-old woman. She ran this household, managed the schedules of 2 teenagers, and had once, a lifetime ago, dreamt of being an architect. But in that moment, in front of this stranger, Daniel had reduced her to a child, an incapable child, sent on a trivial errand while the grown-ups made the real decisions. The beige and the gray swatches blurred in her vision. The humiliation was so complete, so public, that it created a strange metallic taste in her mouth. And a dangerous thought, the first of its kind, flickered in the back of her mind. I should write this down. The thought was immediately followed by a chilling fear. A diary? Where would she hide it? He went through everything. The thought was a secret, a tiny, rebellious seed planted in the scorched earth of her self-worth. It was a terrifying secret, a small act of war she wasn't sure she had the courage to wage. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to form a word, and walked towards the kitchen, her movements stiff and robotic, feeling the weight of both men's eyes on her back. As we continue the journey of the overcoming of Maya, we remember where we left her, with a fragile spark of hope, deciding to confide in her best friend, Claire. But sometimes, the enemy you prepare to fight on the battlefield has already infiltrated your own command tent. The battle for Maya's soul would not be fought against the quiet loneliness she had grown accustomed to, but against a far more insidious poison, one whispered by the person who had vowed to protect her. Later that evening, after the contractor had left, and a choice of beige had been made for her, she tried to talk to Daniel. She chose her words carefully, aiming for calm, for rationality. "Daniel, the way you spoke to me in front of Mark, it was embarrassing." He finally looked up from his laptop, his expression a perfect mask of mild confusion. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Oh, honey, you're just too sensitive. I was just trying to spare you the stress. You know how you get with these things." He reached over and patted her hand, a gesture that was meant to look like affection, but felt like a final nail being hammered into place. It was the touch of a zookeeper, placating a difficult animal. Her voice felt trapped, a muffled sound inside a thick glass box. This was his pattern, the constant devaluation of her feelings, her thoughts, her very perception of reality. These were the signs of emotional abuse she'd timidly started to read about late at night. In that moment, her self-image, the one she tried so desperately to hold together, didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 unrecognizable pieces on the floor between them. She saw a distorted reflection in each one. A fool, a hysteric, an oversensitive child. He had defined her, and the most terrifying part was that, under the weight of his relentless campaign, a part of her was starting to believe him. How do you fight an enemy who insists the war only exists in your head? The days following the incident with the contractor were a study in forced normalcy. Maya moved through her home with a brittle sort of cheerfulness, a mask she polished each morning. She complimented Daniel on a tie, asked the kids about their day, and spoke about the new beige walls with an enthusiasm that tasted like ash in her mouth. The secret thought, the one about documenting his cruelty, remained a hard, cold knot in her gut. It was a terrifying idea, a rebellion she hadn't yet found the courage for. She told herself she was overreacting, that Daniel was right, she was just too sensitive. She was trying to believe it, desperately trying to shrink herself and her feelings to fit into the peaceful picture of the life everyone else saw. The illusion held for nearly a week, a fragile truce in a silent war, until a phone call with her sister, Rachel, shattered it completely. "I can't believe you're not coming." Rachel's voice crackled with disappointment through the phone. "Mom was really hoping to see you at her birthday lunch on Saturday." Maya's brow furrowed. "Lunch? What lunch? Saturday?" A beat of confused silence hung between them. "The one I told Daniel about on Tuesday," Rachel said, her tone shifting from disappointment to exasperation. "He said he'd tell you right away." "God, Maya, don't you two even talk?" The question was casual, rhetorical, but it landed like a punch. The world tilted slightly. Tuesday. Daniel had come home early on Tuesday. They had dinner together. He'd told her a long, boring story about a colleague. He'd said nothing about a lunch, nothing about her mother, nothing about a message from Rachel. It wasn't possible for him to have forgotten. It was a family birthday. It was important. When she confronted him later that evening, her heart was a tight drum against her ribs. She kept her voice even, presenting the facts as if in a courtroom. "Rachel said she told you on Tuesday about Mom's birthday lunch." Daniel looked up from his tablet, a slow, deliberate motion. He blinked. "Did she?" Tuesday was a busy day. He feigned a moment of thought, his face a perfect picture of innocent recollection. "You know, I think I do vaguely remember her calling. It must have slipped my mind. My apologies. I'll call your mom and explain." His calmness was a wall. She pushed against it, her voice trembling slightly. "Daniel, how could you forget? You know how much that means to her." And then, he pivoted. The mask of benign forgetfulness dropped, replaced by one of wounded indignation. "Wow," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "So, now I'm not allowed to have a simple lapse in memory? I'm managing a multi-million-dollar company, my mind is on 1,000 things, and you're attacking me because of one missed message?" He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment aimed directly at her. "You know, you're starting to sound paranoid, Maya. Do you really think I would intentionally keep a message from your sister from you? That's a pretty dark thought to have about your own husband." There it was, the twist. In the space of 30 seconds, she had gone from the wronged party to a suspicious, paranoid, and accusatory wife. Her pain was not validated. It was diagnosed as a symptom of her own flawed character. The certainty she had felt just minutes before began to dissolve, replaced by the familiar, murky fog of self-doubt. Was she being unfair? He was under a lot of pressure. Maybe he did just forget. This is how he did it. This was his true, dark magic. It wasn't just about making her feel small. It was a strategy of systematic social isolation. He didn't need to lock the doors or cut the phone lines. He just had to become an unreliable narrator, a broken bridge between her and the people she loved. By sabotaging these small connections, he made her doubt every interaction, making her question whether the problem was his actions or her reactions. He was creating an island, and she was its sole, frantic inhabitant, unable to trust her own messages in a bottle. What do you do when the person who is meant to be your safe harbor becomes the one who secretly cuts your lifelines to the shore? It was Saturday evening, and the house was filled with the tense quiet of preparation. They were due at a dinner party at the home of one of Daniel's senior partners, an event that was less a social gathering and more a strategic maneuver in his relentless climb up the corporate ladder. For Maya, it was a performance. Her role was that of the supportive, elegant, effortlessly charming wife. It was a role she had played for years, and tonight, she had wanted to feel it, just for a few hours. She had chosen her armor with care, a dress, the color of a deep forest lake, a rich, vibrant green that had always made her feel alive. It was a recent purchase, a small act of defiance against the beige-toned world she felt she was fading into. Standing before the full-length mirror, she felt a flicker of the woman she used to be confident, radiant, a woman who took up space. For a fleeting moment, she felt beautiful. She smoothed the silk fabric over her hips, took a deep breath, and went to show Daniel. He was standing by the window, adjusting his cufflinks, the very picture of success. He turned as she entered, and his eyes did a slow, methodical sweep from her shoes to her face. It was not the appreciative glance of a husband, but the cool, detached assessment of a judge. A small, almost imperceptible frown line appeared between his brows. He tilted his head. "Are you sure about that one?" he asked, his voice neutral, which was always more dangerous than when it was angry. "That color, it's a bit harsh. It makes you look tired." The word hung in the air, a small, perfectly aimed dart. It wasn't a dramatic insult. It was far more clever than that. It was a piece of destructive criticism disguised as concern. In an instant, the flicker of confidence she had felt was extinguished, as if smothered by a heavy blanket. The vibrant green of the dress suddenly seemed garish and loud. The fabric, which had felt like a second skin, now felt like an ill-fitting costume. She turned back to the mirror, but the reflection had changed. She no longer saw the dress. She saw only the faint shadows under her eyes, the lines of exhaustion at the corners of her mouth that she hadn't noticed before. He had given her a new lens through which to see herself, a filter of flaw and inadequacy. The doubt began to creep in, a cold, insidious vine wrapping around her thoughts. Was he right? Did she look tired? Old? Did everyone see her this way? And was he the only one honest enough to say it? It was a masterful move, a classic maneuver in his campaign of psychological warfare. The goal wasn't just to express a preference, it was to destabilize her right before a public appearance. It was to ensure that she would not be his confident partner, but a nervous, self-conscious accessory, her mind too preoccupied with her own perceived failings to truly connect with anyone else. It was an act of emotional abandonment in plain sight, choosing to diminish her rather than to celebrate her. She stood frozen, the image of herself unraveling like a cheap sweater from a single pulled thread. If she changed, she was admitting he was right, handing him the victory. If she didn't, she would walk into that party with his voice echoing in her ears, a relentless narrator pointing out her fatigue, her poor judgment, her lack of grace. Every smile she received would feel like pity, every compliment would sound like a lie. He had successfully sabotaged her evening before they had even left the house, planting a seed of self-doubt that would now blossom into a thorny garden of anxiety for the rest of the night. She looked away from the mirror and at her closet, filled with other dresses, each one now a potential mistake, a fresh opportunity for his quiet, devastating judgment. How do you defend yourself against an attack that isn't a loud explosion, but a single drop of poison placed carefully in your cup when no one else is looking? The ghost of the dinner party lingered for days. Maya had played her part, smiling until her cheeks ached, and making conversation that felt like blowing bubbles, pretty, empty, and gone in an instant. The experience left her feeling hollowed out, a beautifully dressed shell. It was this profound emptiness that ignited in her a desperate need for something tangible, something that was hers alone. She found herself thinking of a small pottery studio she'd seen tucked away in a quiet part of town. The thought of it was an anchor. The idea of taking a lump of formless clay and shaping it with her own hands into something real, something of substance, it felt like the perfect antidote to her own invisibility. It was a small dream, but it was hers. And like everything else in her life, it came with a price tag that required permission. For 2 days, she rehearsed the conversation in her head. She would be casual, breezy. She'd mention the course as a fun, inexpensive way to de-stress. She strategized as if she were a junior executive pitching a proposal to a CEO, not a wife talking to her husband. The very need for this rehearsal was a testament to the suffocating power imbalance that defined their marriage. He managed their vast fortune, but she had no real access to it. Her name was on accounts she couldn't touch, a symbolic partner in a firm where she had no voting rights. She was given a generous allowance for household expenses, a term that made her skin crawl, as if she were a teenager and not the co-architect of their life. Anything beyond that, anything just for her, required a formal request. It was a system of absolute control disguised as traditional family values, and its primary function was to keep her tethered. She finally asked him on a Thursday night, as he was scrolling through stock market reports on his tablet. Her voice sounded unnaturally high to her own ears. "Daniel, I saw a ceramics course I'd love to take. It's just for a few weeks." He didn't look up immediately. He let the silence stretch, a deliberate pause that made her feel like a petitioner, awaiting a verdict. Finally, he lowered the tablet. "Ceramics," he repeated, the word sounding absurd in his mouth. "And how much is this, class?" She told him the amount, her voice shrinking with every word. He considered it for a moment, then gave a magnanimous sigh. "All right," he said. He reached for his wallet, a sleek, expensive leather object that seemed to symbolize his entire being. He didn't pull out a credit card. Instead, he methodically counted out the cash, the crisp bills making a soft, rustling sound. He handed them to her. The transaction felt sordid, like a payment for services rendered. Then came the final twist of the knife. He smiled, a tight, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There you go. Just be careful not to spend it all on your little hobbies." Little. The word was a pat on the head, a dismissive wave of the hand. It wasn't just condescending. It was a strategic tool of financial manipulation. The money in her palm suddenly felt heavy, transactional. It wasn't a gift. It was a leash. A golden leash, to be sure, but a leash all the same. The joy and excitement she'd felt for the class were instantly tainted with a feeling of chronic shame. She was a grown woman, being handed pocket money and a warning not to be frivolous. It reinforced the deep-seated feeling of inferiority he had cultivated in her for years. This was the architecture of her gilded cage. The bars weren't made of iron, but of dependence. They were forged in a fire of condescension and polished with a veneer of generosity, making them all the more difficult for the outside world to see, and for her to escape. How do you build a future of your own when you are not a partner in the present, but merely an employee on a tightly controlled budget? The kitchen was a sanctuary of routine, its familiarity a thin shield against the chaos in Maya's mind. She stood at the counter, chopping vegetables for dinner, the rhythmic thud of the knife against the cutting board a metronome for her thoughts. Each slice was precise, a small act of control in a life that felt increasingly like a house of mirrors, where every reflection distorted her truth. The memory of Daniel, handing her the cash for the ceramics course replayed, each word little hobbies a splinter under her skin. She was trying to hold on to the spark of her idea, the vision of clay taking shape under her fingers, but it was slipping, drowned out by a creeping doubt that maybe she was foolish for wanting it at all. The doubt wasn't just about the course, it was about her, about whether she had the right to want anything beyond the role she'd been assigned. That evening, Daniel's parents were coming over for dinner, a monthly ritual that always left Maya feeling like she was auditioning for a part she'd never quite master. His mother, Patricia, had a way of praising Maya's domestic efforts, with a smile that felt like a critique, and his father, George, treated her with a benign neglect that made her feel like furniture. As she set the table, her hands moved automatically, arranging silverware with a precision that belied the storm inside her. She wanted tonight to be different. She wanted to be seen, not as Daniel's wife or Ethan and Lily's mother, but as Maya, someone with thoughts, dreams, a voice. She clung to this fragile hope as she adjusted a napkin, her fingers brushing the edge of a plate. Dinner began smoothly, the conversation a predictable dance of updates about Daniel's work and the kids' school. Maya waited for an opening, a moment to share something of herself. It came when Patricia asked about the new beige walls. Maya seized it, her voice tentative but warm. "I've been thinking about adding some art to the living room," she said, picturing vibrant, handcrafted pieces she'd seen online. "Maybe even trying ceramics to make something myself." The words felt like a step into sunlight, a rare moment of exposure, but before Patricia could respond, Daniel chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. "Ceramics?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Maya's got her little projects, keeps her busy." The table went quiet, the air suddenly thick. Patricia's smile tightened, and George's fork paused mid-air, his eyes sliding to Daniel as if waiting for the punchline. The dismissal was subtle, a velvet glove over a steel fist, but it landed with devastating force. Maya's face burned, not with anger, but with the weight of being diminished in front of others. Her idea, her small bid for individuality, had been reduced to a quaint distraction, something to keep the housewife occupied. The silence that followed was worse than laughter. It was the collective indifference of a room that had already moved on. She stared at her plate, the food blurring into a smear of color. The pressure to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect daughter-in-law, it was a stone on her chest, pressing until she could barely breathe. This was the expectation, not just from Daniel but from everyone, to stay in her lane, to be grateful for her comfortable life, to never reach for more. The feeling of inferiority was no longer just a whisper, it was a chorus, drowning out the woman she was trying to become. She excused herself to clear the plates, her movements mechanical, each step a retreat from the table and from herself. In the kitchen, alone, she gripped the edge of the sink, the cold metal grounding her. The shadows of the room seemed to shift, mimicking the way Daniel's words twisted her reality. She was starting to see the pattern, the deliberate way he undermined her in front of others. It wasn't just about control, it was about erasing her, and the worst part, a part of her, was letting him. How do you reclaim your worth when the world around you seems determined to convince you that you have none? The ceramics course was supposed to be Maya's lifeline, a fragile thread to a version of herself she could still remember. She had signed up despite the sting of Daniel's condescension, clutching the cash he'd handed her like a talisman. The studio was a small, sunlit space that smelled of earth and possibility, and for the first hour of her first class, she felt a flicker of freedom. Her hands sank into the cool clay, coaxing it into a rough shape, and for that brief moment, she was not a wife or a mother but a creator, someone who could make something from nothing. But the feeling didn't last. By the time she returned home, Daniel's voice was waiting for her, not in person, but in her head, replaying his dismissal, little projects. The clay's promise began to crumble, and with it, her sense of self. That night, she stood in the bathroom, the door locked, the only place she could steal a moment alone. The fluorescent light cast a harsh glow, turning the mirror into a merciless judge. She stared at her reflection, searching for the woman who had once laughed easily, who had sketched building designs in the margins of her college notebooks. But the face looking back was a stranger's eyes shadowed, lips pressed into a thin line, a faint crease of worry etched between her brows. She tried to smile, to summon some remnant of that younger self, but the expression felt like a lie, a mask that didn't fit. The doubt that had been planted by Daniel's words, by his parents' indifference, by the world's silent agreement, had taken root. It whispered a brutal question. What's the point? The ceramics, the dreams, the small acts of rebellion, were they just delusions, childish attempts to pretend she was more than what she'd become? The feeling of uselessness was a slow poison, seeping into every corner of her mind. She thought of Ethan and Lily, her children, who barely looked up from their phones when she spoke. She thought of the dinner party, where her attempt to shine had been snuffed out like a candle in a storm. She thought of the beige walls, chosen for her, a symbol of a life she hadn't designed. Each memory was a brick in a wall that boxed her in, convincing her that her efforts were futile, that she was futile. The weight of it made her shoulders sag, her hands idle at her sides. She hadn't cried, not yet, but the urge was there, a pressure behind her eyes, held back by a stubborn refusal to surrender completely. She turned away from the mirror, unable to bear the hollow gaze any longer. Her phone sat on the counter, a silent witness to her unraveling. She unlocked it, her thumb hovering over the browser. She wanted to search for something, anything, to name this suffocating despair, but the fear of Daniel finding her search history stopped her cold. Instead, she opened a note app, her fingers trembling as she typed a single line. I don't know who I am anymore. She deleted it immediately, as if the words themselves were evidence that could be used against her. The act was a microcosm of her life, reaching for expression, then retreating in fear. The bathroom felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air thin. She was drowning on dry land, and no one could see it. In that moment of quiet despair, a memory surfaced, unbidden. Her mother, Eleanor, sitting at the kitchen table years ago, a worn Bible open before her, reading aloud in a voice that was both soft and unshakable. Maya couldn't recall the exact verse, but the rhythm of it, the promise of refuge, lingered like a half-forgotten song. It was a faint light in the darkness, a reminder of a time when she'd believed in something bigger than her pain. She clung to it, not as salvation, but as a question, a possibility that there might be a way out of this hollow place. How do you find the strength to keep going when the mirror shows you nothing but a shadow of who you used to be? The house was asleep, but Maya was wide awake, sitting on the edge of her bed in the guest room she'd claimed as her own. The darkness was heavy, broken only by the faint glow of a streetlight slipping through the blinds. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers knotted together, as if holding herself in place. The events of the past weeks, the contractor's dismissal, Rachel's missed message, the dress, the ceramics money, the dinner with Daniel's parents had piled up like stones, each one pressing her closer to a breaking point she could feel but not name. Tonight, though, it was a new wound that kept her awake. At dinner, she'd shared an opinion about a local election, something small, carefully phrased to avoid conflict. Daniel had looked at her across the table, his smile sharp as a blade, and said, "Sweetheart, let's not bore the kids with politics you don't understand." Ethan had snorted, Lily had smirked, and the moment passed, but it left a gash in Maya's soul. Her own children, her heart's anchor, had joined in the casual dismantling of her worth. The humiliation was a living thing, coiling around her chest, squeezing until her breaths came shallow and quick. She felt invisible, not just to Daniel, but to the world she'd built. The woman who had once dreamed of designing skyscrapers, who had read poetry under oak trees, was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't even hold her own at her own dinner table. The desire to disappear was overwhelming, not to die, but to vanish, to slip out of existence like a wisp of smoke, leaving no trace of the failure she'd become. She imagined walking out the front door, barefoot, into the night, and never coming back. The thought was both terrifying and seductive, a siren call promising relief from the relentless weight of being her. She stood, her legs unsteady, and moved to the window. The street outside was empty, the neighborhood silent under a blanket of stars. Her reflection in the glass was a ghost, faint and fragmented. She pressed her forehead against the cool pane, trying to ground herself, but the despair was a tide, pulling her under. She was nothing, a wife who wasn't loved, a mother who wasn't respected, a woman who wasn't seen. The ceramics class, her one small rebellion, felt like a cruel joke now. What was the point of shaping clay when she couldn't shape her own life? The question echoed, unanswered, in the hollow of her mind. In that silence, a memory stirred, soft as a whisper. Her mother's voice, years ago, reading from a Bible with a cracked leather cover. The words were blurry, but their cadence was a lifeline. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." It was a fragment of Psalm 23, a verse from her childhood, when faith had been as natural as breathing. She hadn't prayed in years, hadn't thought of God as anything more than a distant concept. But now, in this moment of utter desolation, the words were a raft in the storm. She didn't know if she believed them, not really, but they were something to hold on to, a thread to keep her from slipping over the edge. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and closed her eyes. The verse looped in her mind, not as a promise, but as a question. Could there be a shepherd for someone as lost as she was? She didn't have an answer, but the act of asking felt like a defiance, a refusal to let the darkness win. It was the smallest of sparks, barely enough to see by, but it was there. She didn't move for a long time, letting the silence settle, letting the memory of her mother's voice carry her through the night. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair, a possibility, faint and fragile, that she might not be as alone as she thought. What do you cling to when the world has convinced you that you're not worth saving? The morning after her night on the floor, Maya woke with a heaviness that felt like a bruise across her entire being. The memory of Daniel's dismissal at dinner, the smirks of her children, and the suffocating urge to vanish lingered like a bad dream. But something else lingered too, the faint echo of Psalm 23, her mother's voice weaving through the words, "The Lord is my shepherd." It was a strange thing to cling to, this half-remembered verse from a faith she'd long since set aside. Yet, in the gray light of dawn, it felt like the only solid thing in a world that kept slipping through her fingers. She sat on the edge of the bed, her bare feet cold against the hardwood, and made a decision. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was deliberate. She would find that verse, hold it in her hands, and see if it could hold her back. She waited until the house was empty, Daniel at work, Ethan and Lily at school, before moving to the living room. The Bible was still there, tucked on a shelf among cookbooks and forgotten novels, its leather cover worn from her mother's hands. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the spine, as if touching it might burn, or worse, disappoint. When she finally opened it, the pages fell naturally to Psalm 23, the paper creased from years of use. She read slowly, her lips moving silently. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The words were a melody, familiar yet foreign, stirring a longing she couldn't name. They didn't erase her pain, but they offered a momentary refuge, a place to rest her weary mind. Sitting on the couch, the Bible open in her lap, Maya felt a tug of hope, fragile as a spider's thread, but also a shadow of doubt. What if this was just another delusion, like the ceramics class, a desperate grab for meaning that would crumble under Daniel's scrutiny? The thought made her chest tighten, but she pushed it aside. She needed something, anything, to anchor her. If the psalm was a raft, she would climb aboard, even if she didn't know where it would take her. She reached for her phone, careful to use the incognito mode she'd learned about in a late-night search. Typing Psalm 23, meaning, she found articles and forums, voices from strangers who described the verse as a promise of guidance, a shepherd's care in the darkest valleys. The words darkest valley hit her hard, a mirror to her own life. Her search didn't stop there. The psalm had opened a door, and she stepped through, typing, "Why do I feel worthless in my marriage?" The results were a flood articles on emotional neglect, videos on narcissistic behavior, blog posts from women whose stories echoed hers. She read about gaslighting, about how a partner could twist reality until you doubted your own mind. The term was a revelation, a name for the fog she'd been lost in. It was both terrifying and liberating, like finding a map in a maze. She bookmarked a site, her heart racing, aware that every click was a risk. Daniel didn't need to see her phone to sense her rebellion. His control was a shadow that followed her everywhere. As she closed the browser, Maya felt a shift, subtle but real. The psalm and the knowledge she'd found weren't solutions, not yet, but they were tools, the first she'd claimed for herself in years. She looked at the Bible, still open to the psalm, and whispered, "Okay, shepherd. Show me the way." It wasn't a prayer, not exactly, but it was a plea, a surrender to something bigger than her despair. The doubt was still there, whispering that she was foolish, that Daniel was right about her. But for the first time, she answered it with a quiet defiance. She would keep searching, keep reading, keep holding on to the anchor she'd found. Where do you turn when the only path forward is through a valley you're not sure you're strong enough to cross? The sun had barely risen, painting the kitchen in soft golds, but Maya was already awake, her coffee untouched on the counter. The Bible lay open to Psalm 23, its words a quiet hum in her mind, but it was her phone that held her attention. Last night's search had cracked something open, and now she was diving deeper, chasing the threads of truth she'd glimpsed. In incognito mode, she typed gaslighting and marriage, her fingers hesitant, as if the words themselves might summon Daniel from his office upstairs. The screen filled with articles, checklists, and stories, women describing lives that felt like distorted echoes of her own. One phrase kept appearing, sharp and unyielding: narcissistic abuse. It was a term she'd never heard, yet it felt like a key, unlocking memories she'd buried under layers of self-doubt. She clicked on a blog post titled, "Signs of a Narcissist Partner," Each point was a punch, belittling comments disguised as jokes, shifting blame, making you question your reality. She saw Daniel in every line: the way he dismissed her in front of the contractor, the forgotten message from Rachel, the dress that made her look tired. The words gaslighting and narcissistic abuse weren't just labels, they were a mirror, showing her a war she'd been fighting without knowing its name. Her breath caught as she read about manipulation tactics, how a narcissist could make you feel crazy for noticing their cruelty. It was like reading her own diary, one she hadn't dared to write. The Psalm's promise of green pastures felt distant, but this knowledge was a different kind of anchor, cold, hard, and real. Maya's hands trembled as she opened a note app, her thumb hovering over the blank screen. She wanted to write it down, to capture this revelation before it slipped away, but fear stopped her. What if Daniel found it? He'd already called her paranoid. This would be proof in his eyes. Still, the need to name the beast was stronger than her fear. She typed, gaslighting. He makes me doubt myself. The words looked stark, accusing, but they also felt like a shield, a first act of defiance. She saved the note in a hidden folder, her heart pounding as if she'd just stolen something precious. Naming the abuse was a victory. Small but seismic, like planting a flag on contested ground. The sound of footsteps on the stairs snapped her back to reality. She locked her phone, her pulse racing, and grabbed her coffee mug, pretending to sip as Daniel entered. He didn't look at her, just poured himself a cup and muttered about a meeting. His indifference was a relief, but it also stung, a reminder of how little she registered in his world. As he left, she thought of the psalm, of the shepherd leading through the valley. The valley was clearer now. It wasn't just her marriage, but the mind games that kept her trapped. The knowledge she'd found wasn't a cure, but it was a map, showing her the terrain she had to navigate. She spent the morning reading more, each article a brick in a wall against Daniel's distortions. She learned about documenting abuse, about keeping records to anchor her reality. The idea was daunting, every note was a risk, but it also felt like a lifeline. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd faced her own struggles with quiet faith. The psalm was Eleanor's legacy, but this new knowledge was Maya's weapon, a blend of faith and reason she was only beginning to wield. As she closed her phone, a fragile resolve settled in her chest. She wasn't ready to confront Daniel, not yet, but she was ready to stop believing his lies about her. The beast had a name, and knowing it made her feel, for the first time in years, like she might one day outrun it. What does it mean to find the truth when the person you love most has spent years convincing you it doesn't exist? The kitchen was dim, lit only by the soft glow of Maya's phone as she sat at the counter, her hidden folder open. The single line she'd written, gaslighting. He makes me doubt myself, stared back at her, a quiet accusation that felt both empowering and terrifying. The past few days had been a whirlwind of secret research, each article on narcissistic abuse, a revelation that made her past with Daniel snap into focus. The Psalm 23 verse, "He restoreth my soul," echoed in her mind, a fragile promise she clung to as she navigated this new map of her reality. She was beginning to see the shape of her cage, but the knowledge was a double-edged sword, cutting through her denial and exposing raw fear. What if she was wrong? What if she was, as Daniel always said, just too sensitive? That afternoon, Daniel came home early, a rare occurrence that caught her off guard. He was in a good mood, his smile almost warm as he set a bouquet of lilies on the counter. "Thought these might brighten your day," he said, his voice light, as if they were a couple in a romantic comedy and not a battlefield. Maya froze, her fingers tightening around her mug. The flowers were beautiful, their white petals a stark contrast to the beige monotony of their home, but they felt like a trap. She mumbled a thank you, her mind racing. This was the Daniel she'd fallen in love with years ago, charming, attentive, the man who'd made her believe she was special. The dissonance was dizzying, and for a moment, the articles, the terms like gaslighting and narcissistic abuse, seemed like exaggerations, the ravings of an overactive imagination. Dinner was a performance of normalcy. Daniel was engaging, asking Ethan about his soccer practice, teasing Lily about her latest obsession with true crime podcasts. He even turned to Maya, his eyes soft, and asked about her ceramics class. She answered cautiously, expecting a barb, but none came. He nodded, said it sounded interesting, and moved on. The absence of criticism was disorienting, like stepping onto solid ground after weeks on a rocking ship. As they cleared the table, he brushed her arm, a gesture that sent a shiver through her, not of desire, but of confusion. Was she imagining the abuse? Had she blown his flaws out of proportion? The doubt was a siren, luring her back to the familiar waters of self-blame. Later, alone in the guest room, Maya opened her phone, the hidden note glaring at her. She reread it, then her finger hovered over the delete button. The lilies, his kindness, his normalcy, it all felt like evidence against her. Maybe she was the problem, too sensitive, too quick to see malice where there was none. The psalm's promise of restoration felt hollow now, a fairy tale for someone else. She was on the verge of erasing the note, of surrendering to the comfort of denial, when a memory stopped her. Last week, he'd forgotten Rachel's message about her mother's birthday. The week before, he'd humiliated her in front of the contractor. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, and his kindness tonight was just another move in the game. She didn't delete the note. Instead, she added a new line. He was nice today, but it doesn't erase the truth. It was a small act, but it felt like pushing a boulder uphill, exhausting yet defiant. The doubt hadn't vanished, it never would, not entirely, but naming it gave her a foothold. She thought of the psalm, of the shepherd guiding through the valley. The valley wasn't just Daniel's abuse, it was her own mind, the way it turned against her. Closing her phone, she whispered the verse to herself, a reminder that restoration wasn't a straight path but a jagged one, full of stumbles. She'd fallen tonight, seduced by the siren of doubt, but she hadn't drowned. How do you hold on to the truth when the person who hurts you can make you question whether the hurt ever happened at all? The lilies still sat on the kitchen counter, their petals starting to curl at the edges, a silent reminder of Daniel's fleeting kindness. Maya avoided looking at them as she washed dishes, the clink of plates, a steady rhythm against the chaos in her head. Last night's near surrender, when she'd almost deleted her secret note, had left her shaken. The doubt that had surged, am I making this up, was a wound, raw and aching, but it had also forced her to confront a truth. Daniel's charm wasn't a reprieve, it was a tactic, a way to keep her off balance. The realization was bitter, but it carried a strange clarity, like waking from a fever dream. She thought of Psalm 23, He restoreth my soul, and wondered if restoration could begin not with victory, but with understanding her own stumbles. As she scrubbed a pan, Maya replayed the dinner, dissecting Daniel's behavior. His warmth, his questions about her ceramics class, they weren't genuine. They were a performance, a way to blur the lines of his control. She saw it now, the way he'd steered the conversation back to himself, the subtle edge in his tone when she spoke too long. It was a pattern, one she'd missed because she'd been so desperate for a scrap of kindness. The shame of falling for it burned, but it also sparked something new, a determination to learn from the fall, to turn her weakness into a stepping stone. She dried her hands, grabbed her phone, and opened the hidden folder. Her note was still there, a quiet act of rebellion. She added, His kindness is a mask. Don't trust it. The act of writing grounded her, but it also brought a flood of memories, other moments when Daniel's charm had disarmed her, only to be followed by a cutting remark or a cold dismissal. She saw herself in those moments, always apologizing, always shrinking. The pattern wasn't just in his actions, it was in her reactions, the way she'd let his words define her. The insight was painful, like pulling a splinter from deep under her skin, but it was also freeing. She wasn't just a victim, she was a participant, and that meant she could change. The psalm's promise of green pastures felt closer now, not as a destination, but as a direction, a path she could choose to walk. Later that day, at her ceramics class, Maya felt the weight of her realization. As she shaped the clay, her hands steadier than before, she thought about resilience not as a grand, heroic trait, but as the quiet choice to keep going, even after a fall. The instructor, a kind woman with clay-dusted fingers, praised her progress, and for the first time, Maya didn't deflect the compliment. She let it settle, a small victory against the voice that called her worthless. When she got home, Daniel was in the living room, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly at her muddy shoes. You're tracking dirt everywhere, he said, his tone light but pointed. A week ago, she'd have apologized, scurried to clean it up. Today, she met his gaze, her voice calm. I'll take care of it, she said, and walked past him to the kitchen. It wasn't defiance, not yet, but it was a shift, a refusal to crumble under his scrutiny. The moment felt like a crack in the wall she'd built around herself, letting in a sliver of light. She wasn't free, not by a long shot, but she was learning. The fall had taught her to see Daniel's tactics, to recognize her own patterns, and to choose differently. The psalm echoed in her mind, a reminder that restoration was a process, not a single leap. As she cleaned her shoes, she felt a quiet strength, like a tree bending in a storm but not breaking. She was still in the valley, but she was moving, one careful step at a time. What does it mean to rise when you've learned that falling is part of finding your way? The air in the ceramic studio was thick with the scent of damp clay, a grounding contrast to the sterile beige of Maya's home. Her hands worked the wheel, coaxing a lump of earth into a smooth curve, each motion a small act of creation. The class was becoming her sanctuary, a place where she could be more than Daniel's wife or Ethan and Lily's mother. But even here, his voice followed her, a faint echo of last night's jab. You're tracking dirt everywhere. Her calm response had been a victory, but it was fragile, a single stone in a path she was still learning to build. As she shaped the clay, Maya's mind churned, seeking something stronger to hold on to, something to arm her against the doubt that still crept in like fog. At home, later, she sat at the kitchen table, her phone hidden behind a stack of cookbooks, the hidden folder, with her notes, Gaslighting. His kindness as a mask was a lifeline, but it wasn't enough. She needed more than words. She needed understanding, a way to navigate the maze Daniel had built around her. In incognito mode, she typed, "How to deal with narcissistic abuse," her heart thudding with the fear of being caught. The search led her to a psychology blog discussing emotional resilience, and one concept leapt out: cognitive reframing. It was a way to shift how you saw a situation, to change its meaning without changing the facts. The idea was simple but powerful, like turning a kaleidoscope to reveal a new pattern in the same pieces of glass. The blog explained how abusers like Daniel used criticism to erode confidence, but reframing could turn their words into noise, not truth. When he called her sensitive, she could see it as his attempt to control, not a flaw in her. The concept clicked, aligning with the Psalm 23 verse she'd been clinging to. He leadeth me beside the still waters. The still waters weren't just peace, they were clarity, a place where she could see her reflection undistorted by his lies. She opened her hidden folder and wrote, "Reframe his words. They're his weapon, not my reality." The act of writing felt like forging a tool, one she could wield in the quiet battles of her daily life. That evening, Daniel provided a test. As they sat in the living room, he glanced at her ceramics project, a small, uneven bowl she'd brought home, and smirked. "That's quaint," he said, the word dripping with condescension. A month ago, she'd have internalized it, seen her work as childish. Now, she took a breath, picturing the still waters, and reframed his comment in her mind. "He's trying to make me small because he's threatened by me growing." She didn't respond, just nodded, her silence not submission but strategy. The moment passed, and she felt a spark of pride, not for the bowl, but for herself. She'd used her new tool, and it had held. The blog had mentioned other strategies, like journaling to track patterns, and mindfulness to stay grounded. But cognitive reframing felt like hers, a bridge between the Psalm's faith and the practical need to survive. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd found strength in Scripture. Maya was finding it in Scripture and science, a blend that felt like her own. As she closed her phone, she imagined the clay she'd shaped today, still soft but taking form. That was her, too malleable but growing solid, each small act of resistance, a turn of the wheel. The valley of Psalm 23 was still dark, but she was learning to carry her own light, a flicker of knowledge that could guide her through. The victory was quiet, but it was real. Daniel's smirk hadn't wounded her, it had shown her she could choose what to believe. She wasn't free yet, but she was arming herself, building an arsenal of truth to face the war she was only beginning to understand. How do you fight a battle when the weapon you need most is the courage to believe in your own reality? The living room was a battlefield of unspoken tensions, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the beige carpet. Maya sat on the couch, a book in her lap, but her eyes were on Daniel, who was pacing while barking orders into his phone. His voice was sharp, commanding, the tone of a man who expected the world to bend to his will. She'd grown used to this version of him, the one who filled every space with his presence, leaving no room for her. But today, something was different. A small vase from her ceramics class sat on the coffee table, its uneven rim a testament to her effort. Daniel had mocked it days ago, and she'd reframed his words, but now, as he ended his call and turned his gaze to the vase, she felt a spark of something dangerous, anger. "You're still keeping that thing out?" he said, his tone light but laced with disdain. "It's cute, Maya, but it's not exactly art." His smile was a challenge, daring her to react. A month ago, she'd have swallowed the hurt, apologized for her hobby. But the tools she'd gathered, her notes, the psalm, the concept of reframing, had built a quiet strength inside her. The anger wasn't loud or reckless. It was a steady flame, burning through the fog of doubt. She thought of Psalm 23. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," and saw the valley, not as despair, but as this moment, this test of her resolve. The shadow wasn't death, it was Daniel's attempt to erase her. She took a slow breath, her hand steady on the book. "I like it," she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "It's mine, and I'm proud of it." The words were simple, but they were a line in the sand, a refusal to let him define her worth. Daniel's smile faltered, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he masked it with a chuckle. "Suit yourself," he said, turning away, but the air had shifted. Her anger hadn't erupted, it had guided her, a compass in the storm. She'd wanted to lash out, to tell him how his words cut, how his control suffocated her. But the psalm's promise of a shepherd's guidance held her back, channeling her rage into something sharper, clarity. Later, alone in the guest room, Maya opened her phone and added to her hidden notes, "Anger isn't weakness. It's a signal I'm still here." She'd read online that anger could be a healthy response to violation, a sign of self-respect. The idea was new, almost foreign, but it resonated. Her anger wasn't about destroying Daniel, it was about protecting herself, a fire that could light her way, instead of burning her down. She thought of the ceramics vase, imperfect but hers, and saw it as a symbol of her emerging self, a creation born from her hands, not his approval. The Psalm's words looped in her mind, a reminder that the valley wasn't a place to linger but to pass through. Her anger was a step forward, a refusal to stay silent in the shadow. She wasn't ready to confront Daniel fully. Her notes, her secret knowledge, were still too fragile, but she was learning to harness her emotions, to let them guide rather than consume her. The online forums she'd found spoke of emotional regulation, a term that felt clinical but true. It was about choosing when to speak, when to hold back, like a potter deciding when to press harder or let the clay rest. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the fire of her anger settle into a steady glow. It wasn't gone, it was banked, ready to flare when needed. She was still in the valley, still walking, but she was no longer stumbling blindly. The psalm and her growing knowledge were her staff and rod, tools to lean on as she faced the shadows ahead. For the first time, she felt not just the weight of her pain, but the strength of her own will to overcome it. What does it mean to let your anger be a guide when you've been taught to fear it as a flaw? The ceramic studio was quiet, the hum of the wheel, a soft counterpoint to Maya's thoughts. Her hands guided the clay, her fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The vase she'd defended yesterday sat on a shelf, its imperfections a badge of her growing defiance. But today, a new challenge loomed, one that tested not just her resolve but her values. During class, the instructor had mentioned a local craft fair, a chance to sell her work. It was a small event, but the idea of strangers seeing, maybe even buying something she'd created, sent a thrill through her. Then came the catch. The entry fee was modest, but it would mean dipping into the household budget, a move that required Daniel's approval. The thought of asking him, of facing his inevitable smirk, made her stomach twist. At home, Maya sat at the kitchen table, her phone open to the craft fair's website. The Psalm 23 verse, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies," echoed in her mind, a reminder of provision in hostile territory. But the fair felt like more than a table. It was a stage, a chance to claim a piece of herself. The temptation was strong to bypass Daniel entirely, to use the allowance she'd saved from grocery runs. It would be easy, a secret transaction, a quiet rebellion. She could picture it, slipping the fee into the mail, her name on the vendor list, her vases displayed under the fair's lights. The thought was intoxicating, a shortcut to freedom that promised to bypass the humiliation of his control. But as she stared at the registration form, an unease settled in her chest. Taking the money without telling Daniel wasn't just risky, it felt wrong, a betrayal of the honesty she was trying to rebuild within herself. She'd read online about the importance of integrity in healing from abuse, how small compromises could erode the self-respect she was fighting to reclaim. The Psalm's image of a table prepared in the presence of enemies wasn't about sneaking around, it was about standing tall, even when it was hard. Asking Daniel would be painful, likely ending in another cutting remark, but it would be honest. It would be her choice, not a reaction to his power. She closed the website and took a breath, her decision made. That evening, as Daniel scrolled through his tablet, she approached him, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "There's a craft fair I'd like to enter," she said, naming the fee. His eyes flicked up, a familiar amusement in them. "A fair? For your little clay things?" The jab stung, but she held his gaze, picturing the Psalm's table. "Yes," she said simply. "It's important to me." He shrugged, dismissive but not hostile, and agreed to the fee, though his tone made it clear he thought it a waste. The victory was bittersweet, permission granted, but laced with condescension. Still, she'd chosen the harder path, and that choice felt like a brick in the foundation of her new self. Later, in the guest room, Maya added to her hidden notes, "I chose honesty, even when it hurt." The craft fair was a small step, but it was hers, earned through a moral dilemma she'd faced head-on. She thought of the Psalm, of enemies not just as Daniel, but as her own fears and temptations. The online forum she'd read spoke of values-driven actions, a concept that resonated now. By choosing integrity, she'd aligned her actions with the woman she wanted to be, not the one Daniel tried to define. The valley was still there, its shadows long, but she was learning to walk with purpose, guided by faith and the quiet strength of doing what was right, even when it cost her. What does it mean to choose the hard road when the easy one promises freedom but carries the weight of compromise? The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting delicate stripes across the table where Maya sat, her coffee steaming in the quiet. The craft fair registration was complete, the fee paid with Daniel's reluctant approval, and though his condescension still stung, the victory was hers. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of pride, not just in her ceramics but in herself. She opened her hidden folder on her phone, rereading her notes. I chose honesty, even when it hurt. The words were a milestone, proof she was more than the shadow Daniel tried to make her. Psalm 23's promise. He anointeth my head with oil, my cup runneth over, stirred in her mind, not as a distant hope but as a present truth. Her cup wasn't full, not yet, but it was no longer empty. She stood and moved to the mirror in the hallway, a place she'd avoided since that night in the bathroom when her reflection had been a stranger. Today, she really looked. The woman staring back wasn't the radiant dreamer of her youth, but she wasn't the hollow shell either. Her eyes held a quiet resolve, the faint lines around them a map of battles fought. She touched her face, tracing the curve of her cheek, and for the first time, she didn't flinch at what she saw. There was no rush of self-love, no cinematic transformation, but there was a softening, a glimpse of acceptance for the woman she was becoming. It was like dawn breaking after a long night, not blinding but gentle, enough to see the path ahead. The moment was interrupted by the sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway. Her stomach tightened, but she held on to the feeling in the mirror, tucking it away like a precious stone. She thought of the craft fair, of her vases displayed for others to see, and realized it wasn't just about selling her work, it was about claiming space, about existing beyond the beige walls of her home. The Psalm's image of an overflowing cup felt like a metaphor for this new self, not defined by Daniel's approval or her children's indifference, but by her own choices. She'd read online about self-acceptance, a term that once seemed impossible but now felt like a seed taking root. Later, at her ceramics class, Maya worked with a new focus, her hands sure as she shaped a bowl. The instructor noticed, commenting on her progress, and Maya let the praise land without deflecting it. When she got home, she added to her notes, I saw myself today, and I didn't hate her. The words were simple, but they carried weight, a testament to a shift deeper than any vase she could create. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd found peace in faith. Maya was finding it in faith and action, in the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding herself. Daniel's presence in the house was a constant shadow, but it felt less oppressive now. His latest jab, calling her fair entry a cute side project, hadn't cut as deeply. She was learning to let his words slide past, like rain off a leaf, a skill she'd honed through reframing and the Psalm's steady guidance. The valley of her marriage was still there, its edges sharp, but she was no longer lost in it. The online forums she frequented spoke of reclaiming identity, and she saw it now. Each note, each ceramic piece, each honest choice was a brick in a new foundation. She wasn't free, not yet, but she was becoming someone who could be. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the dawn's light within her, a quiet promise of more to come. The craft fair loomed, a small but real step toward a life of her own. She whispered the Psalm's words to herself, a vow to keep walking, to keep shaping, to keep seeing the woman in the mirror as someone worth fighting for. The valley was long, but she was beginning to believe she could reach the other side. What does it mean to see yourself clearly when you've spent years believing you were nothing but a shadow? The craft fair was a week away, and Maya's small collection of vases and bowls lined the guest room, each piece a quiet testament to her growing courage. She stood among them, her fingers tracing the uneven rim of a bowl, feeling the weight of her journey. The Psalm 23 verse, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me," hummed in her mind, a promise she was beginning to trust. Her hidden notes, now a growing record of Daniel's tactics and her own resilience, were her map through the valley. Today, she opened the folder on her phone, not to add but to read, to see the path she'd walked. Each entry, gaslighting, his kindness is a mask. I chose honesty was a marker, a proof that her pain wasn't imagined. The clarity was both a relief and a burden, like finding a map in a labyrinth only to realize how vast it was. As she scrolled, Maya saw the pattern emerge, not as scattered incidents, but as a deliberate campaign. Daniel's dismissals, his forgotten messages, his calculated kindness, they weren't random, they were a system, designed to keep her small. The realization was a cold light, illuminating the truth she'd been too afraid to face. Her marriage wasn't just flawed, it was a battlefield. She sat on the bed, her breath shallow, and thought of the Psalm's shepherd, guiding through the valley. The valley wasn't just her doubt, it was Daniel's abuse, and naming it gave her power. She wasn't crazy, oversensitive, or paranoid. She was a woman fighting for her soul. The narrator's voice, if you could hear it, would turn to you now, asking, have you ever had to become a detective in your own life, piecing together clues to prove your pain was real? Maya's notes were her evidence, not for a courtroom, but for the jury of her own heart. They were a lifeline, tethering her to reality when Daniel's words tried to unravel it. She thought of the online forums she'd found, where women shared stories of documenting abuse dates, times, exact phrases. The practice was clinical, almost forensic, but it was also sacred, a way to honor her truth. She added a new note, I see the pattern now. It's not me, it's him. The psalm's promise of goodness and mercy felt like a companion to this work, a reminder that clarity was a form of grace. She imagined the shepherd not as a distant figure, but as a presence beside her, pointing to the map she'd made. The valley was still there, its shadows deep, but she was no longer wandering blindly. Her faith, once a faint memory, was now a steady pulse, intertwined with the knowledge she'd gained. She'd read about trauma-informed journaling, a term that sounded academic but felt like survival. Writing wasn't just recording, it was reclaiming, a way to take back the narrative Daniel had stolen. Later, as she prepared dinner, Daniel's voice cut through the quiet. You're spending a lot of time on those clay things, he said, his tone light but pointed. A month ago, she'd have shrunk, apologized. Now, she met his eyes, her voice even. They're important to me. The words were a shield, forged from her notes and the psalm's strength. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't push, and the moment passed. It was a small victory, but it felt like a mountain scaled. She was learning to trust her map, to see the terrain of her life clearly. As she closed her phone that night, Maya felt a shift, like a lock clicking into place. The pain was still there, but it was no longer a formless beast. It had a shape, a name, a story. She was becoming the author of that story, not its victim. The psalm's words were her guide, the notes her proof, and together, they lit the path ahead. She wasn't out of the valley, but she was moving, one deliberate step at a time, toward a dawn she could almost believe in. What does it mean to map your pain when the one who caused it insists it doesn't exist? The guest room was Maya's refuge, its quiet walls a stark contrast to the tension that hummed through the rest of the house. She sat cross-legged on the bed, her phone open to her hidden notes, the screen's glow the only light in the dim space. The craft fair was days away, and her vases were ready, but her mind was on the map she'd built, each note a marker of Daniel's abuse, each one a step toward clarity. Psalm 23's promise, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me, lingered like a soft echo, but today, it wasn't goodness she wrestled with, it was mercy. The word felt heavy, like a stone she wasn't sure she could carry. Mercy for Daniel, who'd spent years dismantling her, or mercy for herself, for believing his lies for so long. She reread her latest note. I see the pattern now. It's not me, it's him. The truth was a lifeline, but it came with a shadow anger, sharp and unyielding, mixed with a quieter pain for the years she'd lost. She thought of forgiving Daniel, not for his sake but for hers, to free herself from the bitterness that clung like damp rot. The psalm's mercy wasn't a command to absolve him, she realized. It was an invitation to release the poison she'd been carrying. She imagined it like untying a rope that bound her to a sinking weight, letting it fall into a river and drift away. The image was vivid, almost physical, and it steadied her. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the map of her pain, it was about choosing not to let it define her path. Online, she'd found a forum post about forgiveness in abusive relationships, describing it as a gift to oneself, not the abuser. The idea resonated, aligning with the psalm's promise of mercy following her. She didn't have to confront Daniel or absolve him, she just had to stop letting his cruelty live rent-free in her heart. She added to her notes, mercy is for me, not him. I let go to move forward. The words were a vow, a small but deliberate act of reclaiming her peace. It wasn't easy, anger flared at the thought of Daniel's smirk, but the act of writing felt like loosening the rope, letting the river take a little of the weight. That evening, Daniel tested her resolve. As she arranged her vases for the fair, he leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. You're really going all in on this craft thing, huh? His tone was mocking, a needle meant to prick her confidence. She felt the familiar burn of anger, but instead of lashing out or shrinking, she pictured the river, the rope slipping free. Yeah, she said, her voice steady, I am. She didn't explain or defend, just kept working, her hands sure. His silence was telling a flicker of unease in his eyes before he walked away. The moment was small, but it felt like a triumph, proof that mercy for herself could be a shield, not a surrender. The psalm's mercy was like a seed, she thought, planted in the cracked soil of her heart. It didn't erase the valley or the shadows, but it promised growth, a future where pain wasn't the only story. The forums had taught her about self-compassion, a term that felt like the psalm's mercy in practice, treating herself with the kindness she'd give a friend. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the weight of mercy settle, not as a burden, but as a choice. She wasn't forgiving Daniel yet, maybe never would, but she was forgiving herself for staying, for believing, for surviving. The valley was still there, but she was walking with a lighter step, guided by a faith and knowledge that were hers alone. What does it mean to offer mercy to yourself when the world has taught you to carry only blame? The craft fair was 2 days away, and Maya's guest room had become a workshop, her vases and bowls arranged like soldiers ready for battle. She ran her fingers over a glazed bowl, its deep blue surface catching the morning light, and felt a quiet pride. The Psalm 23 verse, "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," stirred in her mind, evoking not just rest, but growth, a place where patience could take root. Patience was a word she'd always associated with waiting, with passivity, but now, as she prepared for the fair, it felt different, active, deliberate, like tending a garden through uncertain seasons. She was learning to wait for her own blooming, even as Daniel's shadow loomed. She opened her hidden notes, the record of her journey through the valley. The latest entry, "Mercy is for me, not him," had shifted something, lightening her steps. But patience was harder, especially when Daniel's tactics were relentless. Yesterday, he'd accidentally knocked over one of her vases, apologizing with a smirk that said it was no accident. The old Maya would have crumbled, seeing it as proof of her futility. Now, she saw it for what it was, a desperate grasp for control. She'd cleaned up the shards without a word, her silence not defeat but a choice to wait, to let her actions at the fair speak louder than his cruelty. Patience, she realized, wasn't about enduring abuse, it was about trusting her own timing. Online, she'd read about radical acceptance, a concept that paired with the Psalm's green pastures. It wasn't about approving Daniel's behavior, but accepting it as real, not her fault, and focusing on what she could control: her vases, her notes, her growth. The idea was like planting seeds in rocky soil, knowing some would sprout despite the odds. She added to her notes, "Patience is trusting I'll grow, even in this valley." The words were a commitment, a vow to tend her own garden, no matter how barren the ground seemed. The Psalm's pastures weren't a promise of instant peace, but a call to cultivate it, one small choice at a time. That afternoon, Daniel pushed again. As she packed her ceramics for the fair, he hovered, his voice dripping with false concern. "You sure you're ready for this? People can be brutal about amateur stuff." The jab was meant to wound, to make her doubt her work. She felt the sting, the urge to snap back, but she pictured the green pastures, the slow, steady work of a gardener. "I'm ready," she said, her tone even, her eyes on her boxes. The words were a fence, protecting her fragile blooms. He left without another word, his silence a small victory for her patience. She wasn't fighting him, she was outlasting him, growing stronger with each quiet choice. The Psalm's pastures were a vision of patience as power, not passivity. Maya saw it now. Every vase she'd shaped, every note she'd written, was a seed planted in faith and watered with knowledge. The online forums had taught her about delayed gratification, a term that felt like the Psalm's call to rest in the process. She wasn't free yet, but she was learning to trust the seasons of her life, to believe that her work would bear fruit. As she sealed the last box for the fair, she felt a calm settle, like the hush of a garden at dawn. The valley was still there, its shadows sharp, but she was tending her own patch of green, learning to wait for the harvest she was building with her own hands. The fair loomed, a test of her patience and proof of her growth. She wasn't just selling vases, she was claiming her place, one careful step at a time. The Psalm and her knowledge were her tools, guiding her through the rocky soil toward a future she could almost see. She closed her phone, her heart steady, ready to face whatever came next. What does it mean to plant seeds in a storm when the only promise is that the sun will rise one day? The craft fair was tomorrow, and Maya's guest room buzzed with nervous energy. She packed her ceramics with care, each vase and bowl wrapped in soft cloth, her hands steady despite the flutter in her chest. The Psalm 23 verse, "Thou anointeth my head with oil," played in her mind, a symbol of being chosen, valued, not for what she did but for who she was. The fair was more than a sale, it was a declaration of her existence, a step out of Daniel's shadow. But as she worked, a new challenge emerged, not from him, but from within. The fear of being seen, truly seen, by strangers who might judge her work, her worth, was a quiet tremor. She'd spent years shrinking. Could she now stand tall? She paused, sitting on the bed, and opened her hidden notes. The latest entry, "Patience is trusting I'll grow," reminded her of the garden she was tending. But today, she needed something deeper. Love, not for others, but for herself. The idea felt foreign, almost indulgent, after years of Daniel's voice telling her she was less. She'd read online about self-love, a term that sounded soft but felt like a fortress, a way to protect the woman she was becoming. The Psalm's anointing wasn't just divine, it was a call to anoint herself, to claim her own value. She wrote, "I am enough, even if he can't see it." The words were a vow, a boundary against the doubt that still lingered. That evening, Daniel pushed, as if sensing her growing strength. As she labeled her boxes for the fair, he leaned against the counter, his voice casual but sharp. "Hope you're not expecting too much from this. It's just a small-town thing, not exactly a gallery." The jab was familiar, meant to deflate her, but Maya felt a shift. She pictured the Psalm's oil, a shield of worth, and set a limit. "I'm doing this for me," she said, her tone firm, her eyes meeting his. That's enough. The words hung between them, a wall she'd built with her own hands. Daniel's mouth twitched, but he said nothing, turning away. The silence was a victory, proof that love for herself could be a weapon, not just a comfort. The moment echoed later as she stood before the hallway mirror, the same one where she'd once seen a hollow stranger. Now, she saw a woman with tired eyes but a steady gaze, someone who'd survived and was learning to thrive. She didn't love every part of herself, not yet, but she was starting to believe she could. The online forums had described boundary setting as an act of self-love, a way to say, I deserve respect, even from myself. It was what she'd done with Daniel, not out of anger, but out of a quiet insistence on her own worth. The Psalm's anointing was her permission to stop apologizing for existing, to stop begging for scraps of validation. As she returned to packing, Maya felt the tremor of fear ease. The fair wasn't about proving herself to others. It was about proving to herself that she could show up, flaws and all. The Psalm and her knowledge were twin pillars, holding her up. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd found love and faith. Maya was finding it in faith and action, in the courage to claim her space. The valley was still there, its edges rough, but she was no longer hiding in its shadows. She was stepping into the light, one vase, one boundary, one act of love at a time. The fair loomed, a chance to be seen, but more importantly, to see herself. She closed her phone, her heart full, not with grand emotion but with a quiet certainty. She was enough. And that was the most radical love she could offer. What does it mean to love yourself when you've been taught that your worth lies only in what others think of you? The craft fair morning dawned crisp, the sky a pale blue that made Maya's nerves hum like taut wires. She loaded her ceramics into the car, each piece a fragile extension of herself, and drove to the town square where tents were already blooming like wildflowers. The Psalm 23 verse, Thy rod and thy staff they comfort me, whispered in her mind, a reminder of strength and vulnerability. Setting up her booth, she arranged her vases and bowls with care, their colors catching the sunlight. The fair was a leap, a public claim of her space, but fear gnawed at her. What if no one stopped, no one cared? Courage, she realized, wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. As the fair began, people drifted by, some pausing to admire her work, others passing without a glance. Each indifference stung, echoing Daniel's voice. It's just a small-town thing. But she held fast to the Psalm's staff, picturing it as a steady hand on her shoulder. A woman stopped, lifting a blue vase, and said, This is beautiful. Did you make it? Maya nodded, her throat tight, and managed, Yes, I did. The woman bought it, smiling, and the moment was a spark, igniting a quiet courage. She wasn't just selling ceramics, she was standing in her truth, visible and unapologetic. At home, Maya opened her hidden notes, the record of her valley's shadows. The latest entry, I am enough, had carried her through the fair, but courage was the flame that lit her path today. She'd read online about exposure therapy, a way to face fears by stepping into them, and the fair felt like that, a deliberate plunge into the unknown. She wrote, Courage is showing up, even when I'm scared. The words were a torch, burning away the doubt Daniel had sown. The Psalm's rod and staff weren't just protection, they were tools to forge ahead, to face the world with her head high. That evening, Daniel tried to dim her light. As she unpacked her remaining pieces, he glanced at the cash she'd earned, modest but hers, and said, Not bad for a hobby. The jab was meant to belittle, but Maya saw it for what it was. His fear of her growing strength. She pictured the staff, steadying her, and replied, It's more than a hobby, it's mine. Her voice was calm, but it carried a new edge, a courage that unnerved him. He muttered something and left, his silence a small triumph. The moment was proof that courage wasn't loud, it was the quiet resolve to claim her worth, even in his presence. The fair had been a crucible, forging a bravery she hadn't known she had. The Psalm's comfort was like a bellows, fanning her inner flame. Online forums had described courage as action under fear, a definition that resonated now. Each sale, each conversation with a stranger, had been a step through the valley's shadows, guided by faith and the knowledge she'd gathered. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd faced hardship with quiet grit. Maya was finding her own, a blend of scripture and survival. The valley was still there, its path uneven, but she walked with a surer step, her courage alight against the dark. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the flame of courage settle in her chest, warm and steady. The fair was over, but its lessons lingered, a reminder that she could face fear and not break. She wasn't free from Daniel's control, not yet, but she was building a self he couldn't touch. The Psalm and her notes were her rod and staff, guiding her toward a future where fear was no longer her master. She was ready for the next step, whatever it might be, her heart alight with the courage to keep going. What does it mean to carry a flame through the dark when every step feels like a risk? The afterglow of the craft fair lingered in Maya's bones. a quiet hum of triumph as she tidied her guest room. Her ceramics, now fewer after the sales, stood like sentinels on the shelf, each one a marker of her courage. The Psalm 23 verse, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies," resonated anew, not as a distant promise but as a reality she'd tasted, standing at her booth, seen and valued by strangers. Yet, the valley's shadows remained, sharpened by Daniel's latest tactic. Last night, he dismissed her fair earnings as pocket change, his words a calculated jab to dim her light. Today, Maya sought a new tool to see through his distortions, to hold her truth steady. She sat on the bed, her phone open to her hidden notes, the map of her pain and progress. The latest entry, "Courage is showing up," was a spark, but she needed more, a lens to simplify the chaos of Daniel's mind games. Online, she'd found a psychology article about deconstructing manipulation, a process of stripping an abuser's tactics to their core intent: control, not complexity. The idea clicked, aligning with the Psalms table, a place of clarity where enemies were exposed. Daniel's jabs weren't about her ceramics or her earnings, they were about keeping her small. She wrote, "His words are control, not truth. See them for what they are." The insight was like adjusting a camera's focus, turning a blurry image sharp. She thought back to his pocket change comment, seeing it now as a tactic, not a judgment. It wasn't about the money, it was about her growing independence, a threat to his power. The Psalms table wasn't just abundance, it was truth, a space where she could sit and see clearly. She'd read about intentional focus in the forums, a way to filter out an abuser's noise by zeroing in on their motives. It was simple but powerful, like clearing fog from a windshield to see the road ahead. That afternoon, Daniel tested her new lens. As she worked on a new ceramic piece in the garage, he leaned in, his voice silky with false curiosity. "Still playing with clay? You're not thinking this is a career now, are you?" The jab was layered, mocking her effort, questioning her ambition. A month ago, she'd have spiraled, doubting her worth. Now, she pictured the Psalms table, a place of truth, and saw his intent, to shrink her dreams. She paused, her hands still on the clay, and said, "I'm doing what I love." Her voice was steady, her words a mirror reflecting his tactic back at him. He blinked, thrown off, and left without a reply. The victory was quiet, but it felt like a stone thrown into a still pond, rippling outward. The lens of truth simplified her battle, stripping Daniel's words to their raw purpose. The Psalms table was her vantage point, a place to sit with her notes and see the valley clearly. She wasn't fighting 1,000 slights, she was resisting one goal: his control. The forums had taught her to focus on the root, a strategy that paired with her faith, giving her a way to navigate without losing herself. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd found clarity in scripture. Maya was finding it in scripture and insight, a blend that lit her path. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the lens of truth settle, a tool to carry through the valley. Daniel's tactics were still there, but they were less daunting, exposed by her new clarity. She wasn't free, but she was freer, each step a defiance of his narrative. The psalm and her knowledge were her anchors, guiding her toward a future where truth, not fear, defined her. The valley's shadows were long, but she walked with a clearer eye, ready to face whatever lay ahead. What does it mean to see through the lies when the liar has spent years convincing you they're the truth? The garage was Maya's makeshift studio, its concrete floor dusted with clay as she shaped a new vase. The craft fair's success, small but real, had left her with a quiet glow, but Daniel's latest jab about her playing with clay still echoed, a reminder of the valley she walked. The Psalm 23 verse, "He leadeth me beside the still waters," hummed in her mind, not as escape but as a call to focus, to see beyond the shadows. Her hidden notes, now a tapestry of truths. His words are control, not truth, were her map. But today, she sought a new tool, a way to replace fear with purpose. To anchor her mind in a future she could build. She paused, wiping her hands, and opened her phone, the hidden folder a sanctuary of her resistance. The fair had shown her she could create, sell, exist outside Daniel's narrative, but fear still whispered, what if he finds out how much this means? She'd read online about visualization, a technique to shift focus from fear to possibility, imagining a desired outcome with vivid detail. It paired with the Psalm's still waters, a place of calm where she could see her path clearly. She closed her eyes, picturing herself at another fair, her booth vibrant with ceramics, strangers admiring her work, her children there, proud. The image was a beacon, pulling her from the fog of what if to the clarity of when. She wrote in her notes, "Visualize freedom, not fear. See the waters, not the shadows." The words were an anchor, grounding her in a vision stronger than Daniel's control. The Psalm's waters weren't just peace, they were a mirror, reflecting the woman she was becoming: resilient, creative, whole. She'd found a forum post about future self-visualization, describing it as a way to rewire the mind, to make hope tangible. It was like planting a flag in the distance, a goal to walk toward, even when the valley's terrain was rough. That evening, Daniel tested her resolve. As she cleaned up her clay tools, he stood in the doorway, his voice laced with mock concern. "You're spending a lot of time out here. Don't let this distract you from what really matters." The jab was subtle, meant to guilt her back into his narrative of dutiful wife. Maya felt the familiar tug of fear. What if he's right? But she pictured the still waters, her booth at the fair, her future self smiling. "This matters to me," she said, her voice calm but firm, her eyes on her tools. The words were a shield, forged in her vision. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he left, his silence a crack in his control. The moment was small, but it felt like a tide turning, her vision stronger than his manipulation. The technique of visualization was a quiet power, like a river carving stone over time. The Psalms waters were her guide, showing her a future not defined by Daniel's voice. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd found hope in faith. Maya was finding it in faith and focus, a blend that steadied her steps. The forums had taught her to replace fear with purpose, a strategy that felt like the Psalms' call to walk with intention. Each time she visualized her freedom, she weakened fear's grip, making space for possibility. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the anchor of her vision settle, a steady weight in the valley's storm. Daniel's tactics were still there, but they were less daunting, overshadowed by the future she was building in her mind. She wasn't free yet, but she was freer, each vision a step toward the waters she could almost touch. The psalm and her knowledge were her compass, guiding her through the shadows toward a dawn she was beginning to believe in. The valley was long, but she walked with purpose, her eyes on the horizon. What does it mean to see a future when the present tries to convince you there's only darkness ahead? The garage smelled of clay and possibility, a sanctuary where Maya shaped her vases under the soft hum of a single bulb. The craft fair's glow lingered, her small sales a quiet rebellion against Daniel's narrative. But his latest jab, warning her not to get distracted, was a fresh weight, a reminder of the valley's shadows. The Psalm 23 verse, "Thou anointeth my head with oil," stirred in her mind, a symbol of being chosen, not just by faith but by her own resolve. Her hidden notes, "Visualize freedom, not fear," were her map, but today, she sought a new tool, a way to break the invisible chain of Daniel's financial control, to claim a piece of freedom that was hers alone. Maya sat on a stool, her phone open to her secret folder, the fair's earnings tucked in a hidden envelope in her toolbox. The money was small, but it was hers, untainted by Daniel's allowance. She'd read online about financial abuse, how control over money was a leash, keeping victims tethered. The article described secret savings as a lifeline, a way to prepare for escape. The Psalm's anointing wasn't just spiritual, it was practical, a call to prepare for a future beyond the valley. She wrote, "Money is my chain, but I can forge my own key." The words were a vow, a step toward a freedom she could almost taste. The idea of a secret fund was daunting. Daniel tracked every penny, questioning even grocery receipts, but the fair's cash was invisible, a small rebellion he couldn't touch. She researched online, in incognito mode, learning about prepaid debit cards and online accounts with no paper trail. The forums called it a freedom fund, a term that felt like the Psalm's oil, anointing her with possibility. She decided to start small, depositing her fair earnings into a digital wallet she set up on her phone, hidden behind a password. The act was quiet, but it felt like snapping a link in the chain, a defiance of Daniel's control. That evening, Daniel tested her strength. As she cleared dinner plates, he glanced at her, his voice casual but probing. "You haven't mentioned that fair money. What'd you do with it?" The question was a trap, meant to pull her back into his ledger. Maya felt a flicker of fear, but she pictured the Psalm's oil, her secret fund, a shield. "I used it for supplies," she said, her tone even, her eyes on the sink. The lie was smooth, a necessary armor. He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. But her heart raced with the thrill of her secret. The moment was a victory, proof that her chain was weakening, link by link. The Freedom Fund was more than money. It was a symbol of her agency, a brick in the foundation of her new self. The Psalm's anointing was a promise that she was worthy of freedom, not just in spirit but in reality. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd found strength in faith. Maya was finding it in faith and strategy, a blend that fortified her. The forums had taught her about financial empowerment, a concept that paired with the Psalm's call to prepare. Each dollar saved was a step through the valley, a defiance of Daniel's power. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the chain of freedom in her hands, not fully broken, but looser, hers to wield. Daniel's control was still there, but it was less absolute, challenged by her secret act. She wasn't ready to leave, not yet, but she was preparing, building a path with every choice. The Psalm and her knowledge were her guide, leading her toward a future where she held the key. The valley's shadows were deep, but she walked with a growing strength, her eyes on the dawn she was forging, $1 at a time. What does it mean to forge a key when the lock you're breaking is the one you've been taught to guard? The garage was a cocoon of quiet, the clay under Maya's fingers yielding to her steady hands as she shaped a new bowl. The secret fund, now a small but growing anchor in her digital wallet, hummed in the back of her mind, a defiance of Daniel's control. The Psalm 23 verse, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," resonated deeply, not as fear, but as a call to move forward, to trust in the unseen. Her hidden notes, "Money is my chain, but I can forge my own key," were her compass, guiding her through the shadows. Today, she sought a new strength, the courage to act despite the unknown, to leap into a future she couldn't yet fully see. Maya paused, her hands still, and opened her phone to her secret folder. The craft fair had been a triumph, but it was only a step. She'd found a local art co-op online, a collective where artisans sold their work year-round. Joining meant a monthly fee, more than her fair earnings could cover, and a commitment to produce regularly, another risk, another ask of Daniel's tightly held budget. The fear was sharp. What if he said no, or worse, mocked her ambition? But the Psalms Valley wasn't a place to stay, it was a path to cross, and crossing meant leaping, even when the ground ahead was hidden in mist. She'd read in the forums about calculated risks, a strategy for survivors to build independence by taking small, deliberate steps into the unknown. The co-op was that step, a chance to grow her craft, her income, her freedom. The Psalms' promise of guidance through the valley was like a lantern, dim but steady, urging her to trust her instincts. She wrote, "Faith is leaping when I can't see the landing." The words were a vow, a commitment to act, not just dream. The co-op wasn't just about selling. It was about believing she deserved a place in the world beyond Daniel's beige walls. That evening, she faced the test. Daniel was in his study, papers spread across his desk, the picture of control. Maya took a breath, picturing the Psalms Valley, and knocked. "I found an art co-op," she said, her voice calm but firm, naming the fee. His eyes narrowed, a familiar smirk curling his lips. "Another hobby expense? You're really stretching, Maya." The jab was meant to shrink her, but she held the lantern of faith, her vision of the co-op clear. "It's an investment," she said, the word deliberate, a claim of her worth. He sighed, dismissive, but agreed, his tone making it clear he thought it foolish. The victory was bitter, tinged with his scorn, but it was hers, a leap taken, a step through the valley. Later, in the garage, Maya felt the weight of her choice settle, not as fear, but as purpose. The co-op was a bridge to a future she was building, one where her craft was more than a hobby. The Psalms' guidance was like a current, carrying her forward, paired with the forum's wisdom of incremental courage. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd trusted faith to carry her through hardship. Maya was trusting faith in action, a blend that felt like wings unfolding. The leap wasn't reckless. It was rooted in her notes, her fund, her growing belief in herself. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the valley's shadows shift, less oppressive under her lantern's glow. Daniel's control was still there, but it was fraying, challenged by her quiet defiance. She wasn't free, but she was moving, each leap a step toward the light. The psalm and her knowledge were her guide, illuminating a path she was learning to trust. The co-op loomed, a new challenge, but she was ready, her heart steady with the faith to keep leaping, even into the unknown. What does it mean to jump when the ground ahead is hidden, and the only certainty is your own resolve? The garage was alive with the scent of fresh clay, Maya's hands shaping a new vase as the early morning light slanted through the window. The art co-op decision was a milestone, its monthly fee, a quiet rebellion against Daniel's control, and the Psalm 23 verse, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life," wove through her thoughts like a golden thread. Her hidden notes, "Faith is leaping when I can't see the landing," were a tapestry, each entry a stitch in the story of her survival. Today, she stood at a crossroads, reflecting on the lessons of her valley: mercy, patience, courage, truth, faith. They weren't just words, they were the warp and weft of a new self, stronger than the woman Daniel tried to erase. Maya paused, her hands still, and opened her phone to her secret folder. She scrolled through her notes, each one a hard-won truth. His words are control, not truth. I am enough. Courage is showing up. Together, they formed a pattern, a map of her journey through the shadows. The Psalm's promise of goodness and mercy wasn't a distant hope, it was here, in her defiance, her ceramics, her secret fund. She saw the valley clearly, now not as a trap, but as a crucible, forging her into someone who could face the darkness and still create beauty. She wrote, "I am the goodness and mercy I've been seeking." The words were an epiphany, a crown woven from her pain and perseverance. The Psalm's final verse was a multifaceted gem, reflecting light in new ways. First, it was a declaration. Goodness and mercy were her birthright, not Daniel's to withhold. Second, it was a mirror, showing her as the shepherd of her own soul, guiding herself through the valley with faith and knowledge. Third, it was a seed, planted in her heart, promising a harvest of freedom if she kept tending it. She imagined the verse as a loom, her choices, the threads, each note, each vase, each quiet stand against Daniel, a vibrant strand. The online forums had spoken of integrated healing, blending faith, psychology, and action. Maya lived it, her tapestry proof that she was more than her wounds. That evening, Daniel's voice cut through her reverie. As she packed clay in the garage, he stood in the doorway, his tone sharp. This co-op thing better not interfere with your responsibilities here. The jab was a familiar blade, meant to slice her ambition. But Maya stood at her loom, the Psalm's promise a shield. "I'm managing fine," she said, her voice steady, her eyes on the clay. The words were woven from courage and truth, unyielding. Daniel's silence was telling a flicker of unease in his gaze before he walked away. The moment was a triumph, not loud but resonant, proof that her tapestry was strong, its threads unbreakable. The valley was still there, its shadows deep, but Maya saw it now as part of her story, not its entirety. The Psalm's goodness and mercy were like a river, flowing through her choices, her mercy for herself, her patience, her leaps of faith. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd woven faith into scripture. Maya was weaving hers into a blend of faith, knowledge, and defiance. The forums had described resilience as narrative coherence, a way to make sense of pain through story. Her notes were that story, her ceramics, its chapters, each one a testament to her survival. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the tapestry of her triumph wrap around her, warm and sure. Daniel's control was a shadow, fading against her light. She wasn't free yet, but she was freer, her heart a loom of possibility. The psalm and her knowledge were her guide, threading a path toward a future she could claim. The co-op awaited, a new chapter, but she stood ready, her tapestry a banner of all she'd learned, ready to face the valley with a heart full of mercy and the goodness she'd crafted herself. What does it mean to weave a story of triumph from the threads of your pain when the world expects you to unravel? The garage was a haven, its quiet corners filled with the soft scent of clay and the faint glow of Maya's determination. The art co-op was a week away, her ceramics ready to claim a new stage, and the Psalm 23 verse, "I shall not want," pulsed in her heart, a reminder that her worth wasn't tied to Daniel's approval. Her hidden notes, "I am the goodness and mercy I've been seeking," were a fortress, each word a brick in the wall of her new self. But today, a tremor ran through her resolve. The secret she'd guarded, her notes, her fund, her quiet rebellion, was no longer just a shield. It was a truth that demanded to be acknowledged, if only to herself. Maya sat on the garage stool, her phone open to her hidden folder, the screen a mirror of her journey. The notes were a chronicle of pain and power, from gaslighting to faith is leaping. The secret fund, now a modest but growing sum in her digital wallet, was a lifeline, a promise of freedom. Keeping them hidden had been survival, but it was also a weight, a silent confession of fear. She'd read online about owning your truth, a step in healing where you stop hiding from yourself. The Psalm's promise of not wanting was more than provision, it was sufficiency, a call to embrace her reality without shame. She wrote, "My secrets are my strength, not my shame." The act of writing was a release, like exhaling after holding her breath too long. She wasn't ready to confront Daniel, his control was still a shadow, sharp and cold, but she was ready to confront herself. She closed the folder and stood, her reflection faint in the garage window. For the first time, she saw not a victim hiding secrets, but a woman wielding them, her notes, and fund a sword and shield. The fear of Daniel finding them was still there, but it was quieter, drowned out by a new certainty. These were hers, proof of her survival, and she wouldn't apologize for them, not even in her own heart. That evening, Daniel's presence tested her newfound clarity. As she worked on a new vase, he hovered in the doorway, his voice laced with suspicion. "You're awfully focused on this clay stuff lately. What's got you so driven?" The question was a probe, meant to unearth her defiance. A flicker of fear sparked, "What if he knows?" But Maya pictured the Psalm's sufficiency, her secrets a strength. She kept her hands on the clay, her voice calm. "It's something I'm good at," she said, her words steady, a truth untainted by his doubt. He studied her, his eyes narrowing, but he left without pushing, his silence a small crack in his armor. The moment was a quiet liberation, proof that owning her truth, even silently, gave her power. The unveiling of her secret to herself was a pivot, not a shout but a whisper, shifting her from hiding to standing. The Psalm's promise was a foundation, paired with the forum's wisdom of self-ownership. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd found peace in faith. Maya was finding it in faith and truth, a blend that anchored her soul. The valley was still there, its shadows deep, but she walked with a lighter heart, her secrets no longer a burden but a badge. The co-op loomed, a chance to shine, but this moment was brighter, her truth, owned and unashamed, a flame Daniel couldn't snuff out. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the weight of fear lift, replaced by a quiet resolve. Daniel's control was still real, but it was less absolute, challenged by her inner strength. She wasn't ready to leave, but she was ready to live. Her notes and fund a testament to her defiance. The psalm and her knowledge were her guide, lighting a path through the valley toward a future she could claim. She stood taller, ready for the co-op, ready for herself, her heart steady with the courage to carry her truth. What does it mean to embrace your secrets when they're the only proof you have of your own fight? The morning sun spilled into the garage, painting Maya's ceramics with a soft gold as she prepared for the art co-op. The Psalm 23 verse, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever," hummed in her heart, not as a distant heaven, but as a present peace, a home she was building within herself. Her hidden notes, "My secrets are my strength, not my shame," were a cornerstone, proof of her journey through the valley. The secret fund, growing with each small sale, was her lifeline, a quiet defiance of Daniel's control. Today, she lived in a new normal, her actions shaped by a hard-won calm, a desire to be heard not through shouts, but through the steady rhythm of her life. Maya moved through the house with a purpose that felt like a gentle tide, washing away the old patterns of fear. She made breakfast, her hands steady as she flipped pancakes for Ethan and Lily, who mumbled thanks before retreating to their phones. A month ago, their indifference would have cut deep. Now, she saw it as their own struggle, not her failure. She thought of the co-op, her ceramics soon to be displayed in a shared space, a quiet claim of her voice. The Psalm's eternal dwelling was her anchor, a vision of a life where she was seen, not by Daniel's gaze but by her own. She added to her notes, "I'm heard in my choices, not his silence." The day unfolded with small, deliberate acts. At the co-op, she set up her booth, her vases catching the light, each one a word in the story she was telling. A fellow artisan, a woman with kind eyes, praised her work, and Maya let the compliment settle, her smile genuine. She'd read online about authentic presence, a way to live fully in each moment, and it felt like the Psalm's call to dwell forever, not in fear, but in truth. She interacted with customers, her voice steady, her pride quiet but real. Each sale, each nod of appreciation, was a note in her song, a way to be heard without begging for it. That evening, Daniel's shadow loomed, as it always did. As she unpacked her co-op earnings small, but hers he glanced over, his tone sharp. "You're spending a lot of time on this side gig, hope it's worth it." The jab was meant to diminish, to pull her back into his narrative. But Maya stood in her new normal, the Psalm's dwelling a shield. "It is," she said, her voice calm, her eyes meeting his. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of her truth, a refusal to shrink. He frowned, thrown by her quiet strength, and turned away. The moment was a victory, not loud but profound, proof that her voice, even soft, could echo. The co-op was more than a marketplace. It was a stage for her new self, a woman who lived with intention, not reaction. The Psalm's promise was a home she carried, paired with the forum's wisdom of living intentionally. She thought of her mother, Eleanor, who'd found refuge in faith. Maya was finding it in faith and presence, a blend that grounded her. The valley was still there, its shadow softer but real, but she walked with a steady gait, her choices a song of her own making. She was heard, not in Daniel's approval, but in the life she was crafting, piece by piece. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the quiet dawn of her new normal settle, a peace that was hers alone. Daniel's control was still a shadow, but it was fading, challenged by her steady light. She wasn't free, but she was freer, each choice a step toward the house she was building. The Psalm and her knowledge were her foundation, guiding her through the valley toward a future where her voice would ring clear. The co-op was just the beginning, a promise of more to come. What does it mean to be heard when the only listener you need is the woman you're becoming? The garage was a quiet fortress, Maya's hands steady as she packed new ceramics for the art co-op, their glazes catching the late morning light. The Psalm 23 verse, "He restoreth my soul," echoed in her heart, a reminder of the peace she'd carved out through her notes and her craft. Her hidden folder, "I'm heard in my choices, not his silence," was a beacon, guiding her through the valley's fading shadows. The secret fund, growing with each co-op sale, was her anchor, a silent promise of freedom. But today, a new unease stirred, a fog creeping at the edges of her calm. It wasn't Daniel's voice, not yet, but something subtler, more insidious, threatening the dawn she'd fought so hard to reach. Maya moved through the house, her new normal, a delicate balance of defiance and routine. She smiled at Ethan as he grabbed his backpack, nodded at Lily's mumbled plans for the day. Their distance had softened, but it still stung, a quiet ache she'd learned to carry. At the co-op, she arranged her booth, her vases drawing warm nods from passers-by. The rhythm of her life felt steady, her voice heard in each sale, each choice. But as she drove home, a memory surfaced, sharp and unbidden. Lily's tone last night at dinner, clipped and cold, echoing Daniel's dismissive edge. "Mom, you're always out in that garage," she'd said, her eyes flicking away. The words were small, but they landed like a stone, stirring the fog. Alone in the garage, Maya opened her phone, her hidden notes a refuge. She reread her entries, grounding herself in her truth, but the fog persisted. Lily's words weren't just teenage moodiness, they carried a familiar sting, a shadow of Daniel's control. She'd read online about alienation, how abusers could turn others, even children, against their target. The idea was a cold wind, chilling the warmth of her progress. Was Daniel planting seeds in her kids, shaping their view of her? The Psalm's promise of restoration felt distant now, a light obscured by this new worry. She wrote, "Lily's words hurt. Is he turning her against me?" The unease grew as she reflected. Ethan's recent defense of Daniel, "Dad's just stressed," Mom flashed in her mind, another thread in the fog. The co-op, her fund, her notes, they were her strength, but they couldn't shield her children's hearts. The valley's shadows were shifting, not fading, taking a new form. She'd fought to reclaim herself, but what if Daniel was stealing her kids' love, twisting their view of her into something small, like his? The thought was a knife, cutting deeper than his jabs ever had. The Psalm's restoration wasn't just for her soul, it was for her family, a bond she'd die to protect. That evening, the fog thickened. At dinner, Lily snapped when Maya asked about school, her tone sharp. "Why do you care so much? You're always busy with your clay stuff." The words were Daniel's, refracted through her daughter's voice, a mirror of his disdain. Maya's heart sank, but she held the Psalm's promise, her voice calm. "I care because I love you," she said, her eyes soft but steady. Lily looked away, silent. But the moment was a warning, a new battle looming, not just for her freedom, but for her children's trust. As she closed her phone, Maya felt the fog settle, a challenge she hadn't foreseen. Daniel's control was evolving, reaching beyond her to the ones she loved most. She wasn't defeated, but she was shaken, the valley's path suddenly steeper. The Psalm and her knowledge were her guide, but the fight was changing, demanding a new kind of courage. The co-op was her stage, but her children were her heart, and the fog of their distance was a shadow she couldn't ignore. She stood ready, her resolve firm, but the question lingered, heavy and cold. What does it mean to fight for your soul when the enemy begins to claim the hearts of those you love most? The fog of unease from the night before had not lifted. It had settled deep in Maya's bones, a damp chill that even the warm sun in the garage couldn't seem to touch. Lily's sharp words, "You're always busy with your clay stuff," replayed in her mind, each repetition twisting the knife a little deeper. Maya worked on a new piece of pottery, her hands moving with a mechanical rhythm, but her focus was fractured. She scrolled through her hidden notes, her lifeline, and stared at the last entry. "Is he turning her against me?" The question was no longer a fearful whisper, it was a drumbeat of dread. The Psalm's promise of a soul restored felt like a cruel irony when she feared the souls of her children were being methodically poisoned against her. She knew she was in a valley, but she was just beginning to understand that she was not walking it alone. Daniel was actively leading her children into a different, darker one. The new challenge defined itself with chilling clarity that afternoon. Maya was reviewing a credit card statement online, a routine task, and noticed a series of expensive video game purchases. She approached Ethan in his room, keeping her tone light and non-accusatory. "Hey honey, can we talk about these charges? They're a little higher than we agreed on." She expected a flush of embarrassment, a mumbled apology, perhaps a negotiation. Instead, Ethan didn't even look up from his phone. His response was cold, clipped, and terrifyingly familiar. "Dad works hard, Mom," he said, his voice a perfect echo of Daniel's measured condescension. "He says a little financial stress is better than being difficult. Maybe you should just relax about it." The words hit Maya with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. It wasn't just the sentiment, it was the language, the cadence, the chillingly rational delivery. It was Daniel's voice, his very logic, flowing from the mouth of her son, the boy she had taught to be kind, to be compassionate. The fog of unease instantly solidified into a wall of ice. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't teenage rebellion. This was a script, taught and rehearsed. Daniel wasn't just planting seeds, he was harvesting a crop of alienation, turning his own children into soldiers in his silent war against her. The art co-op, the secret fund, her growing confidence, it all felt like a foolish game she'd been playing while the real battle was being waged for the hearts of her children. A wave of grief, so profound it was dizzying, washed over her. This was a new kind of pain, a hollowing out that made Daniel's direct humiliations feel like paper cuts. But as the grief crested, something else rose in its wake, the quiet, steely resolve she had been building for weeks. She did not crumble. She saw the tactic for what it was, the ultimate act of a narcissist who, feeling his control over her slip, was now asserting it through their children. Her knowledge, her notes, her faith, they didn't numb the agony, but they gave it a name. They provided a framework. She was not going crazy. This was real. This was how the narcissist uses the children. She retreated to the garage, her sanctuary, and added a new, shaking line to her notes. He is using them. This is his game now. She wasn't just fighting for her own sanity anymore. The stakes had been raised to an unbearable height. What do you do when you realize the person you're fighting has turned your own heart's treasures into weapons to be used against you? The garage was no longer a sanctuary, it was a bunker. Maya sat on a cold stool, surrounded by the beautiful, silent things she had made with her own hands, but saw none of them. Her son's voice, borrowed from his father, echoed in the space, a ghost that chilled her to the bone. "Dad works hard, Mom, maybe you should just relax." The words were a declaration, not of teenage annoyance, but of a successful indoctrination. The truth she had pieced together from her hidden notes, from late-night research, from the quiet whispers of her own intuition, was now horribly, undeniably complete. She had been so focused on her own escape, on breaking the chains of Daniel's control over her, that she hadn't seen the other chains he was forging. She had been fighting for her own life, while he had been quietly conquering the territory of their children's minds. From the living room, a sound drifted down the hall. Laughter. It was Daniel, holding court with Ethan and Lily. She could hear the murmur of the television, the clink of ice in a glass, the familiar rhythms of a family at ease. But the sound was a lie. It was the carefully curated soundtrack to a hostage situation she was only now beginning to comprehend. She could almost hear the dialogue, the subtle digs at her, the casual reinforcement of his narrative. "Your mother is so sensitive. Your mother doesn't understand pressure. I'm the one who holds this family together." Every laugh from her children felt like a betrayal, a nail in the coffin of the bond she had nurtured since their first breath. It was in that moment that the full meaning of Psalm 91 crashed down upon her. "Surely he shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler." She had always pictured herself as the bird, fighting to get out of the trap. She was wrong. The snare wasn't a small cage meant for one. It was a vast, invisible net, and he had been casting it over their entire home. He had let her struggle, let her think she was breaking free, while he was patiently, cruelly, ensnaring the two people she loved more than life itself. Her journey of overcoming had led her here, to the edge of an even more terrifying valley. The battle was no longer for her own mind, but for theirs. Her personal freedom felt like a hollow victory if she had to leave her children behind in enemy territory, programmed to love their captor and resent their liberator. Her quiet rebellion, her ceramics, her secret fund, they were the tools of a solitary survivor. But how could she use them to fight a war for the hearts of others, a war against an enemy who had convinced them he was their hero? As Maya's journey of overcoming continues, the nature of her battle must change. The comfort of Psalm 23 and the protection of Psalm 91 brought her through the darkest parts of her own valley. But this new fight requires a different kind of faith, a different kind of strength. It is a fight that will be guided by a new and desperate prayer, one that finds its voice in the righteous anger and patient hope of Psalm 37. "Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity. For they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb." The war against Daniel, the manipulator, is over. The war against Daniel, the father who poisons, has just begun. Thank you for walking with Maya through this chapter of her life. In the overcoming of Maya, her fight to escape the fowler's snare has only led her to a more painful battlefield. If her story of resilience has touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Follow our channel to continue this journey with her, because the battle for her children will be long and difficult. How do you rescue your children from a poison they have been taught to call love?